welcome to Tomorrow is the Question, the podcast where we explore what we need to do today for a fully human tomorrow. I'm Jono Baggaley, editor of Fully Human, and in today's episode, we're going to be exploring something that has been a vital part of childhood for as long as there have been children. Something that is joy and magic in itself, but also vital to children's development. It is a feeling and activity we struggle to recapture as adults, but children naturally step into. Sometimes it is called children's work, or the thing that happens when adults aren't looking. It is, of course, play. It would be a grumpy grown-up indeed who wouldn't celebrate play and hope that children can have as much of it as possible. But for nearly a century now, children's opportunities for free play have been declining, as parental fears, automobiles and the very design of our world keep them off the streets, out of the fields and behind front doors, restricting many children to playing in the shadow of their own homes, often in full gaze of adults. This is unprecedented in human history and feels like a potential threat to a fully human future. So I was delighted that Fully Human's Dr. Elly Hanson and I could spend some time in conversation with Tim Gill, expert in children's play, mobility and spatial freedoms. Tim has been thinking and writing about childhood, play and risk for 30 years, as well as advocating for children's right to play and making a real difference to policy and urban design. He brings deep insights and experience across play, childhood and children's lives. So if you're interested to find out how we got here, why it matters, and why there's still plenty of hope for the future of play, stay tuned. Welcome to this Fully Human conversation. I am joined today by Fully Human's own Dr. Elly Hanson, and I'm delighted to be joined by Tim Gill. So Tim, just to kick us off, I just wanted to get a sense, you've obviously been working on issues around play and risk for many, many years. I want to get a sense of what piqued your interest in the first place, what made you think this was a really important area to focus on?
Sure. Well, in the first place, I kind of fell into this topic area, having landed a short-term, part-time job in an organisation which is now called Play England, but it was an NGO that promotes the importance of play. Now, this was in 1994. At the time, I thought I'll give it a go. And short version of the story is the topic, this question of children's spatial lives and how it's been changing, the importance of play really got under my skin. I found it fascinating. It spoke to some of my views about childhood, about what it is to be human. I'm a philosopher by background. If anything, that's my kind of qualification. And then I had a child myself a couple of years later, and so then the topic became even more sort of, central or important. And I've stuck around ever since because I find it endlessly engaging.
And if you think to that early engagement in the topic in sort of 1994, what sort of issues were you thinking about in terms of play then? And obviously we're going to come on to where we are now, but have things changed since then significantly?
The two pieces of work that I remember from those early years, one was I was involved in discussions about playground safety and the sense at the time that there was too much of a focus on, eliminating accidents and the playgrounds were becoming really boring. And so we needed to figure out how to kind of stop going down that road. And we may talk more about that. And the other was looking at streets. And I helped to organise a conference called Play in the Streets in 1995 that called for, slower speed limits and streets to be places where children, or at least some streets to be places where children can play. And again, wider questions about children's opportunities to play and get around their neighbourhoods. So those topics have remained a focus for me, and they're still fascinating. They're still kind of, tough and complex and raise some important questions, I think, about, the status of children, how we think about children and childhood and what a good childhood looks and feels like. I feel like we made some progress, but it's not like we found all the answers.
And when thinking about, you said about the kind of the status of childhood, and I think when we're having these conversations about across the piece in terms of children's policy and trying to enable children to flourish, I often think that we don't always share an understanding of what we're really talking about when we're talking about childhood, or even what we're really talking about when we're talking about children, and to think about why play is critical to children's lives and their futures. I think it's really important that we do start from a position of sort of a sense of, well, what are we really talking about when we're talking about childhood and children? So, I mean, Elly, just to kick off with you, sort of, what do you understand by childhood?
Yeah, what a wonderful, huge question. I think, in some ways it's helpful to go back to the beginning, or at least a beginning, our hunter-gatherer history. Over 95% of human history, we have been hunter-gatherers. And I think that looking at, that context in which we evolved can be really helpful in thinking about who children are and what they are adapted and evolved to do. And we can help. What can help us answer that question is evolutionary anthropology, which looks at kind of current hunter-gatherer societies and how children live, grow and flourish in those, which can then help us to understand if there's a kind of mismatch between the conditions in which we've evolved to flourish and our current society. And one of the things that's coming out from all of that research is that, humans have evolved to have this very long stage of social dependence, in which, children can be children for a long time before having those kind of adult responsibilities and getting involved in reproduction and all of that. Why is that? Well, one part of it is that there's that a freedom, a space in which to develop the skills needed for later adulthood, and play being core to doing that, and that play involving a lot of kind of self-led learning with your peers, and involving actually quite a lot of risk, and it's a lot of it being away from the adult gaze. So children in mixed age groups, exploring their natural environment and learning through play.
Okay, so we're getting a picture here of childhood being a time, quite an extended period, both of dependence, but also a need for literal space, but also space with peers, and to develop skills, but through the activity that we call play. Does this sort of match your thinking around play?
Absolutely, and also really bringing back to what's distinctive about humans, and the title of this series is about being fully human, and that I mean, I think people know that lots of animals play, and so it's kind of important. But humans are unique as a species in having this period of extended dependence. I mean, why is that? It's something about the kind of stuff that in other species is sort of genetic or just already there, isn't there with humans. The young of our species are nature's most efficient and effective learning machines. Right? That's what marks us out, and much of what through our evolutionary history we've learned to survive and thrive, we've learned as young humans through our play and explorations. And now that's not to say we just carry on letting kids explore and roam freely everywhere and anywhere, but it tells us a great deal, I think, about what it looks like when you're going with the grain of children's learning impulses, and what it looks like when you're not doing that, and playing, getting a sense of our own agency, trying stuff on for size, learning from our own efforts and our own mistakes. And also a kind of playfulness in the sense of sort of, slightly subverting or turning the world on its side, jokes, pushing the boundaries, various kinds of risk. They're not just kind of details. They're really central to this, I think, what it is to have a kind of healthy a childhood that kind of represents what it is to be human and to be a kind of engaged and active and responsible human being.
I mean, Tim, that just sounds like a beautiful summary of what play is. And is there a kind of core definition of what it is or what it's for?
Right. I mean, I think generally there's agreement that playing is about children having agency and control and choice over what they're doing and finding that, being engaged in what they're doing. But in really simple terms, I think there are sort of two ways that you often see play framed. One is that, a kind of instrumentalist view that playing is a form of learning, and it has these developmental benefits. And so, we adults should support children in playing because, they'll learn better and so on. And then there's another view, which is really more about seeing playing as something connected with being human, that it's kind of constitutive of us as human beings, that amongst other things, it's a human right, and it is recognised as a right in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So I personally think that both of those views have some merit. If I think about my own approach to, child rearing as a parent, I want my daughter to be kind of happy and enjoying her life in the moment, but I also, want her to have opportunities and to have the chance to make a meaningful and enjoyable life. So they're not in contradiction, but I think right now and in many parts of the world, in many cultures, there's a really strong focus on the instrumentalist view at the expense of that sort of sense of just being. Playing is being human, is being a young human being, and it has value in and of itself.
Yes. And actually, as you're describing those two, they don't strike me as incompatible, that they complement one another. But you can see that the emphasis on always kind of what is it for? How is it going to help children become responsible and flourishing adults, in effect, that actually that can start to detract from just seeing it in its own right.
Yes.
And actually takes us away really from being fully human, doesn't it? If we only consider always what we're doing for what it's going to lead to and develop us into, then we're kind of missing the point.
Yes, and it can also lead to a kind of reductive and sort of partitioning off children's lives. We want them to play because that's connected with being physically active, and we all know it's good to be physically active. So then we kind of, to a lesser or greater extent, emphasise playing in ways that involve bodily movement and so on. Or we might talk about playing as being something that's social, which often play is. Play is often social, it's often physical, but it's not exclusively or universally those things. And in framing play in that way, we undermine the emphasis on agency and on choice and on that kind of strong intrinsic connection and engagement.
Yes, if we're always kind of thinking about what can this play help develop, then we adults start to get involved and start to shape it in ways that may detract from what children, actually allowing children to lead it themselves into in the way in which they need to have it.
Yeah, you've reminded me of a quote from two very well-known they're folklorists, Peter and Iona Opie, who wrote many books on children's play and gathered lots of examples. So well-known in play circles, and they talk about, there's a quote where they're saying, nothing undermines children's free play quite so much as adults who try and make it happen, or something like that. So that's a bit quick, but it also is a measure of the difficulty of the task. If you really believe that one of the things that marks out a healthy, happy, engaged childhood is having these spaces and times where, to all intents and purposes, the adult agendas kind of drop to the background and kind of move out of the picture, that's quite tough. It's quite a tough thing for adults to do, especially and more today, where as children lead more and more of their lives closely supervised, controlled, or overseen by adults.
We don't necessarily notice the extent to which we bring things we have absorbed as adults, like cultures of efficiency and optimization. If we look at children's play and think, okay, through this play, they are learning teamwork and collaboration. But I could design this technology which would do this more effectively. Let us replace the play with these other ways of doing it. That's the logic that you can follow if you don't join these two things together of both the instrumental view of course plays critical for learning, but also the sense that it is valuable in itself, and things like joy and fun and happiness, which you can't optimize.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you mentioned, one of the quickest ways to kill play is for adults to try to make it happen. But also, I think culturally, we are also curtailing play with the way we adults have designed our world over the last century. Do you want to talk a little bit about sort of where we are now in terms of children's play and spatial freedoms, but really how we've got here and what some of the history of that?
Yeah. So I think any of us thinking about our own childhoods, I'm thinking of the grown-ups listening, and particularly, those of us who are maybe at the later stages of our lives will have very resonant memories of having a lot of freedom as we grew up. It's almost, it's become a kind of cliche, isn't it? The sort of nostalgia around roaming free but I think there's that it's too quick to dismiss those memories as nostalgia. So looking way back, one of the things that characterizes childhood often is some space and time where children can explore, can get to grips with the people and places around them, and bringing it a bit closer to home. Playing with their friends in their neighbourhoods and gradually expanding their spatial horizons as children grew up. And that kind of the spatial boundaries of children's lives have been shrinking dramatically. Profoundly over the last century or so. And especially if you look at, say, sort of 8-9-year-old children and you can go back and see that 70, 80 years ago, children of that age would easily travel 3, 4, 5 miles, would have lots of space and time and freedom. And that radius, if you like, that roaming range has been shrinking to the degree that it's most 8-year-old children in the UK and in most other high-income countries are more or less restricted to within the shadow of their own homes. And it's an emotive phrase, but I sometimes talk about children today being reared in captivity because it's a very profound and underexplored change in the nature of childhood. And it does, I think, connect directly and speak to that. What helps a child learn and grow is to have those opportunities. And so if those are disappearing from the lives of children today, then what does that mean? What do we need to do about it? And just finally, there are lots of causes for that shift, but I think fundamental to it is the physical design or the characteristics of neighbourhoods, particularly the growth of the car and the way neighbourhoods are now typically around the world designed first and foremost around cars, and that has had a particularly profound impact on children. That literally the moment children step out of their front doors, there is an imminent threat that we all know, all parents know. The one thing, your one job as a parent when your kids are beginning to leave the house is to figure out how to allow them to deal with that threat, which for the most part means keeping them away from it for quite a long period of time. And that's, we're still, I think, coming to terms with that, even though you can trace it back the best part of 100 years.
And that's so interesting. And, I think probably for most of us, it's hard to imagine a life where the car doesn't play that role. Do you feel that it was inevitable that, once cars were invented and we could all afford one, or many people could, that cars would play this role in our society, or do you think that there might have been a different way of relating to?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. I'm very engaged in exploring that very question now, and I think looking back at the sort of history of the growth of the motor age, it's very clear, and historians are showing this, that there was quite a short period of time as car ownership really took off, when the debate, the kind of terms of trade about the relationship between cars and everybody outside of cars, crucially including children, that debate got reframed completely. So when cars first started emerging in North American cities in the 20s, there was firstly there was carnage. It was appalling. Really. A level of tragedy that is hard to imagine now, and there was moral outrage. There were campaigns, there was newspaper editorials, debates in the highest levels of government, and then within a very short period, about 5 years, thanks basically to the workings of motordom, of the motor industry and other industries, that question about, in a sense, who's got a right to the street became completely turned on its head, and car drivers were given pretty much unfettered access and right to drive where and how they wanted, and everybody else's job was to get out of the way. And that settlement, if you like, that position is, we still see that largely today. And I think it's hard to quite capture just how normalized that is. I think because every single one of us, we grew up in a world in which there was that reality. Parents today are bringing up children in that world as well, and now, so it's really deeply embedded in how we have any kind of engagement with the world outside our front doors. And I think it could have been different. So that settlement, of the laws, the regulations, the education, the messages to children and parents could have taken a different form. And interestingly, I think now just beginning to see some of those fundamental questions being revisited. We are having some debates now about the place and role of cars in cities and in residential streets, and some ideas about how there could be maybe a fairer, and I'm using that word with care, because I think this is actually a question of social justice and spatial justice, a fairer position or a fairer settlement between the rights and claims of car drivers, and cars are not going to go away anytime soon, and the rights and claims of, amongst other people, children. And children uniquely suffer because children, of course, don't drive. And at the very point in their lives where there are so many good reasons for them to be able to start exploring, connecting with the world around them, just making their own way, literally and figuratively, through life. At that very point, there's still this huge barrier. So, yeah, that is a strong focus of my work right now.
So we've got cars as this kind of really central thing. What do you think are some of the other things, either curtailing children's play from in a family context or in schools as well? I mean,
I think the various forms of fears and anxieties are very prominent. Parents themselves, by the way, will in surveys will always say traffic is their biggest fear. So that's even today. That's telling us something. There are clearly various forms of social threat that parents and children are worried about. Both, the sort of bogeyman figure or whatever, but also fears of bullying and various forms of victimization, and certainly some groups of children, young people, girls, children of colour, those are real fears. But I think there is a kind of generalized anxiety about the outdoors now, that about the world outside our front doors, that is almost sort of the embodiment of all our fears, and that needs unpacking. But there are also now some clear examples of how that can be turned around, and how we can actually, a perfect example was the pandemic. So in that first lockdown period, one of the things that we saw in many neighbourhoods was a kind of embracing of the street and of local parks and green spaces. Partly because there was nowhere else we could go, but partly because there was there was zero traffic. So in my street we had people drawing hopscotch on the pavement and writing little messages and stuff. So if the material factors change, then that can open up opportunities for us and for children to have a different relationship to the world outside their front doors.
Fascinating. And I think, it's really interesting that we're thinking here about parenting cultures and the emotions that can take hold for parents. And we've talked a lot about fear and, maybe some origin fears. And I think it's fascinating to really bring to surface something that we've all just swallowed whole, the normality of cars and how we've all had to shape our lives and our children's lives around that. I also think that once you have those fears circulating, then there's kind of these secondary dynamics that can take hold where it's not just fear, it also becomes about shame, and it becomes about social norms. So parents who do want to give their children more freedom feel a stigma to that and feel kind of social judgment. And so it just becomes a vicious spiral. And, we know that, I think the States may have is maybe more stark there than here, reading Jonathan Haidt's recent book, The Anxious Generation, where he talks about, parents being really kind of done for neglect because they've let their child play in a playground by themselves. And, it may not be quite as extreme here, but that's definitely in the mix. And so I think there just really is that need for us to be having these kinds of conversations that really question the fundamentals, the defaults, the assumptions that we've just been schooled in.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad you mentioned firstly, Jonathan Haidt's book is very interesting. Of course, one of the key messages from that is precisely about the value for children of having opportunities to play freely and discover a sense of their own agency and kind of, to develop their resilience, or he talks about children being anti-fragile kind of naturally. So I think being a parent today is honestly I think is tougher than even when my daughter is now 26, and a big factor is that sense that parents are in a goldfish bowl to a much greater extent. Parents have always, there's always been social norms. But interestingly, those social norms can be different in different countries. So, in Germany, in the Nordic states, the idea that one of your jobs as a parent is to help your child to be independent and confident and capable is pretty strong. And in fact, you even show quite dramatic contrasts in the views and kind of approaches of, say, German versus English parents, and there are studies on that. So that's helpful, and it also, I think it's also a reminder things do look different in some countries. In Denmark in 1975, they had levels of child pedestrian casualties that were the worst in Europe. All right, and that's saying something. In that country, the kind of settlement was that government, basically brought in laws to tackle that and to create safer streets for children and allow children to still be able to get around on their own easily. And so now Denmark, has levels of walking and cycling that we could only dream of, and low levels of child pedestrian casualties. So these cultural values can, connect and interact with and influence policy, legislation, design. It's a complicated picture, but I think one of the things that we should hold on to is that change is possible. It's not inevitable that, British families will forever be having to grapple or not be able to turn things around. There's a lively debate happening right now, or set of debates about planning, about new housing, about transport, about public health and air pollution, all of which tie back pretty quickly to these sort of questions about the physical qualities of our neighbourhoods.
It feels like it ties back to what we were talking about at the beginning about views of childhood, that often we'll hear in the policy debate is sort of we must prioritise children. And it's like, yes, but we also need a model. It sounds like, for example, in Germany or the Nordic states you're talking about, I'm extrapolating, but it's sounds like there is a recognition of children's ability to be independent rather than what might be thought of as a sort of deficit model of childhood. And it's not enough to say, well, let's prioritize children in design. We need to have a model, a view of what children are, what they're capable of as well.
Absolutely. We need to take it's a kind of philosophical and an ethical position about children and childhood, and that amongst other things, childhood is a life stage where a growing sense of agency and discovery and exploration and satisfying curiosity is absolutely central. Alongside those other concerns about what children need to be taught, that more sort of that connection with agency and with competence really has slid out of focus, I think, in the last probably 20 or 30 years. I mean, there were people writing about this stuff in the 60s and 70s, Winnicott, the psychoanalyst, well, even Jane Jacobs, who was a famous, probably one of the pivotal writers on cities in the 20th century, devoted a whole chapter of her classic book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, to children and neighborhoods. And, her great concern was, how do children grow up to be engaged and confident and kind of social urban citizens, who feel a connection in a big city where you don't know many people. And her basic answer was that children learn that through their own everyday encounters with people, adults and children, but beyond home and school, because home and school are both quite, they're institutional. And you don't get a sense of yourself as a citizen through the time you're spending in the domestic or the institutional sphere. You get it by being active and visible and interacting with the people in the city that you are sharing with.
Absolutely. And it feels really important when we're having these discussions and thinking about, how do we create the conditions for children to flourish? Picking up Jono's point about starting with and your point, a strengths-based model of childhood and their particular needs and proclivities, and things that they can often do much better than adults, rather than, there is this sense out there that children are kind of mini adults, not able to do things as well as adults, but we can train them into being adults, rather than actually, they can do many things that we can't do. And something really important within all of this is risk, isn't it? And creating the conditions in which children can take kind of rightful risks. And I remember years ago coming across this statement from a number of psychologist academics who were getting really fed up with current kind of health and safety culture, where we're just so focused on children's safety rather than on, like you say, their kind of anti-fragility and their need to develop themselves through risk. And in this statement, they, just said it very directly that, that children need to have these environments in which there's risk. And they clearly didn't want people to then just conclude from that some very kind of minor risks. So they actually named these risks, playing with knives, and climbing trees, climbing on buildings, or and quite crucially outside of the adult gaze, this space in which to develop and grow without all of this adult surveillance and oversight.
Yeah, and there's a rather beautiful emerging set of thinking about what a kind of risk-forward approach to education and learning is. For my sins, I'm the patron of the Forest School Association, which flies the flag for forest school approaches in outdoor learning. I should say, I'm not an educator in the narrow sense, but I fly the flag for children's, for kind of child-centered and outdoor learning. And it's a matter of balance, isn't it? And by the way, you've also reminded me of there's a legendary quote amongst the sort of play work world from an extraordinary woman, Lady Allen of Hurtwood, who I haven't got enough time to lay out all of her achievements, but she was, human rights, children's rights, education, early childhood, and play work, adventure playgrounds. She and an incredible character. But one of her more famous sayings encapsulates what you were just talking about, which is better a broken arm than a broken spirit. Now, at one and the same time, I can hear that's wow, but it's also, whoa, hang on. It's, those debates about risk are ineliminably complex and emotive and hard, and there will never be a right answer. You'll never be able to plug in a set of conditions and turn a crank and get the answer, yes, this is safe or this isn't. But what you can do, and what I've been closely associated with, is help to have some tools and processes that bring together thinking about both, the things that can go wrong, the downside of risk, and the upside of risk, the benefits, the good things that happen when we give children the freedom to learn, to explore, and to learn from their own mistakes. So there's an actual process which is called various names: risk-benefit assessment, benefit-risk assessment, and it's emerged from the kind of play safety world and that early work I talked about going right back to the beginning of my own career, and over time has, spread and gained support. It's got support from the Health and Safety Executive here in the UK, and last year the International Standards Organization, ISO, which is this sort of global industry standards body, drew up standard ISO 4980:2023, which is it's not the most riveting read, I'll say, but it essentially says when you're thinking about children's play, children's leisure, or actually any leisure or recreational activities and play, you should not be doing risk assessments. You should be doing benefit risk assessments. You need to be bringing your thinking about benefits into the picture and into your judgments, because if you don't, there's only one path you'll go down, and that's a risk reduction path. And we know that sooner or later that will get to a crazy point, and that's what we saw in the 90s with playgrounds. And so I'm pleased to say there's kind of a good news story there. People who are listening to this who are thinking, God, health and safety is a bit of a nightmare, and I know it's what I'm doing isn't right, and the kids are losing out, but it feels, what's the alternative? The alternative is to check out these benefit risk or risk benefit approaches. Schools up and down the country are using them in their own thinking about playtimes, about outdoor learning, about residential events and trips. And it is really making a difference and turning that around.
And what feels really important within all of that is this thoughtfulness, this balance. That we're certainly not here just saying we want to expose children to all risks. In fact, Jono and I have spent our careers trying to protect children from certain risks. It's about these particular environments in which there is some risk, which can, be a part of play and help children learn and develop. And I love the kind of elegance and thoughtfulness of the approach that you're taking.
Well, I mean, there's a group of us who've been flying the flag for this sort of approach for some time, and I think balance is crucial. And just again, trying to reframe our thinking about risk. Risk sounds like a sort of, well, it can sound like a scary word, although interestingly, it can also be a sort of appropriated, risk and danger and thrill. But it's really about uncertainty, and it's about recognizing that we live in a world that always has uncertain, it's unpredictable. I mean, in a way, that's one of the things that makes the world extraordinary, is we don't know quite what's going to happen. Children's own explorations and discoveries are full of uncertainty. And so again, a certain way of thinking and looking at risk is part and parcel about what makes human life what it is, and goes right back to some of those patterns of learning and playing, exploring. Children themselves are quite articulate about what's sometimes called risky play, and it's those experiences that give them kind of like butterflies in the stomach, or they'll talk about things being scary funny, and it's and again links with learning ideas about sort of scaffolding and getting a bit outside of your comfort zone, and Vygotsky and all of that stuff that I want to see be a kind of more central part of the conversation about childhood and children's learning and growth.
I suppose a question to you, Tim, you've outlined some of the ways in which at the policy level and at the design level we can start to create the conditions for children to flourish. But for those people listening, particularly parents, but anyone working with children and young people, what do you have sort of practical tips for things they can do now? That might be ways of thinking rather than even things to do. But what do you say from your own experience in terms of how to approach this?
It's a really good question. In the main, my work tries to focus on, in really simple terms, getting everybody else who has an influence on children and parents' lives to make it easier for children to play out and get around their neighbourhoods and generally, have a richer spatial life, and for parents to give permission for that to happen or to be part of getting that to happen. So I don't have a strong focus on parents, and I sometimes think that actually maybe there's a few too many people telling parents how to do their job, and that one of the things that might, or at least let's open up the question whether parents do need yet one more person coming along. However, I do recognise that I kind of want parents to basically be saying, I support what you're doing, and I think it's important for my child and for children to play and explore. And parents do say that. So I think a couple of things. In general, I don't think numbers help very much. I think stories help. And I guess the very basic story I'd want to be laying out for parents is around, what do you want for your child as they grow up? And I think one thing pretty much every parent wants is that their child will be confident, will be kind of capable and, able to deal with the everyday ups and downs that life will throw at them, and responsible, and have a sense of the consequences of their actions. So those sorts of ideas about healthy understanding of agency and choice and intentions. And I'll just share an anecdote that kind of captures that. So a few years ago, I was visiting it was the kindergarten of an elementary school in Toronto, where the teacher, it was by the look of it, a perfectly conventional school, nothing unusual about it. But the head teacher was very thoughtful about risk and outdoor play, and there was a bit of money and interest going into outdoor play in Canada at that time. And two things. She firstly talked about, when she talks to parents, she's really clear, and what she says is, look, one of the things we're in the business of doing here is helping your child to be a responsible person. When do you want that process to start? When do you want your child to start having a sense of being a responsible person? Do you want it now, in kindergarten, in grade 2, in grade 5, grade 11, when they're at their first party, when they're walking down the aisle, when do you want this to start? And you can see, the rhetorical force of that. And the other thing, which is a kind of way of putting this into practice, which I love, but which again is challenging, is that she had a rule that her staff applied, which is called the 17-second rule. And I will share with you now what the 17-second rule is. And in essence, it's that when staff are overseeing children, maybe say in the playground, and they think, oh, maybe this child is about to do something a bit risky, or is maybe, falling out with another child, or, there's some potential adversity in the air, that they don't step in right there and then, that they hold back. And actually they hold back for 17 seconds, hence the 17-second rule. And they just see how things pan out. And firstly, it's a rule, it's not a legislation. So obviously, it's used with thought. But crucially, the vast majority of occasions, the children figure out for themselves how to overcome this situation, or pick themselves up off the ground and dust themselves down, or, so that stepping back, that conscious just being on the sidelines and allowing children to really follow through and understand what's going on and the consequences of their action, was a way of putting into practice in a really meaningful, real way that goal of supporting your child to be more confident and capable. And I think something like that, that really getting parents and educators to think very hard about those second by second, moment by moment interventions and comments and even their presence in the child's world is a big part of that.
I think that does several things, and I can see it almost being used thoughtfully in a policy context, because it's the 17 seconds both says step back. It's giving the child time, but I also think it's giving adults time to curb their natural instincts to step in. And, I feel that as a parent, a lot, and have definitely stepped in when I should have seen that, no, actually, you would have sorted that out yourself. And what you're doing every time is telling children that they're not capable, telling children that you will always be there to help them navigate these risky situations, or that they need your help to navigate these situations in the first place. So I think both, that's an incredibly practical example, but it is also something that we could think about when just thinking about how we design children's the experiences that children have in spaces where we're looking after children, taking a bit of a step back and giving them more time.
Yeah, as well as making those environments and spaces just richer and more engaging. I mean, talk for a second about school playgrounds. I mean, most school playgrounds are let's just say, not very inspiring or rich or engaging places. But there is a program or an initiative around bringing loose parts, stuff that kids can do stuff with into playgrounds, getting the adults who are supervising children in playtimes and lunchtimes to be more thoughtful, to step back, to go, in a way, move away from a kind of no response to a yes response, to make it really simple. There's a beautiful organisation called Opal. I don't have any strong connection with them, but I'm a fan of what they do. Stands for Outdoor Play and Learning. And what's interesting is there are now hundreds of primary schools across the UK and in other parts of the world that are running that program or programs like it. And it's not coming from the top. It's not coming from government saying, oh, we think you need to do more to make playtimes better. It's coming from mainly head teachers in schools that are running these programs and seeing the impact that they have on their students and telling their peers, this is incredible, this is transformational. And I've visited several schools where I've, spoken to the head teachers concerned, and at its best, it really is transformational, and it directly opens up those questions about how we see children and childhood, and helps to move away from that kind of deficit sort of filling a child up with stuff model to a strength-based helping a child discover how the world works and who they are and their place in it model.
Well, I think that's a lovely place for us to draw this to close with some really practical solutions, both at the policy level, at the practical level in schools, and some things to think about for any of us looking after children and trying to enable them to, trying to create the spaces where play can be free for them. Thinking back, just before we close, thinking back to your own childhoods, which I think obviously frame the way that we think about play today, if you think about your favourite place, what was it?
Well, like a lot of people above a certain age, I'm not going to specify what that age is. I had a pretty free-range childhood, and I grew up in a large village in the home counties and had the run of the place. But the places I would gravitate to and had the most resonant memories for me were, wild places where I could climb trees, where there was water, where we were out of sight of the nearest houses. Now, I know, but I want to just take that on a bit. The nostalgia bell is ringing really loudly now. I know that, and I'm not saying that our job is to turn the clock back, or that there was a kind of golden age of childhood. Lots of bad stuff was happening in the 70s. But what I often use that very question in talks about places where we played, and what emerges is that many, many people have the same sorts of memories that I just shared, and that also that there's a very strong emotional response as well, that these places were kind of meaningful. They kind of were places where we helped to somehow find out who we were and what we were capable of, and again, that sense of agency and exploration and freedom, and that I think it may look a bit different, but the takeaway from that is that children today need and want and hunger for just that same sense of discovering who they are and what the world around them is like, and that it is possible, and indeed, it's within our reach and within our gift to give children today something like the same opportunities to get a sense of their own human agency that I had growing up, in the early 70s in Buckinghamshire.
Fantastic. Well, that's one place to wrap up. I think when we think about play, being children exploring, one of the things they're exploring is kind of what might be and possible worlds. And I think one of the things we've heard about here is sort of over the last century, we have come to a particular place which has dramatically curtailed young people's spatial freedoms, their places to play, but that there is real possibility for what might be and redesigning that for children's futures. So I'm certainly left feeling really energized by this conversation. So thank you so much for joining us, Tim.
It's been amazing. Thank you.
And thank you, Elly.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next time. Tomorrow is the Question is a podcast from Fully Human and the PSHE Association, presented by me, Jono Baggaley, with music and sound editing by Nathaniel Pern and production support from Sam Harvey.